Hello, everyone. This is Marilyn Turkovich, the Executive Director of the Charter for Compassion. We're really excited to be with you today again, as we are each month, for our global read. And today is a really special global read for us because it involves two people that I think I know fairly well, two people that I can call friends. And the first is the global read will center on a monograph, a paper that David Korten has so willingly given to us so that it could be shared with each person who's on the global read with us, Ecological Civilization. And the person who will be joining us today, Chris Uxley, will be introducing David. We're very thankful for everyone who is joining us today, and also grateful to those people who have been generous to allow us to keep the global read going throughout the year. We're all set for 2022. So if you come to our website, you'll see the next 12 books that we will be offering next year. And it's a real variety. We try and keep our authors coming from around the world, and I think that you'll be pleased to see the offerings that are in store for you. As we move forward, I mentioned that Chris Uxley will be the host for today's session. And Chris is the past president, or I guess he's still very much involved with the Atlantic Philanthropies, and has been a part of that organization for a number of years. Chris has been involved in international business, philanthropy, policy developments, not only in the United States, Latin America, Asia, Africa, and Europe as well. And right now, he is serving as a chair of the governing board of the Atlantic Institute in Oxford, England, although he's coming to you today from Washington, D.C. I'm going to turn this over right now to Chris, and thank you, and I'll be back with you at the end of this session.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's really a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to introduce and have a chance to have a conversation with David Korten. And to be with old friends. I just want to add a footnote. I'm in Washington, D.C. in the flight path of helicopters that shuttle between Andrews Air Force Base and the Pentagon. And so if you hear helicopters in the background, don't worry. What can I say about David Korten? I'll try to keep it short, and apologies to David for omitting what could be a very lengthy introduction. David, as many of you know, has a long history and experience in academia, in government, philanthropy, has an MBA and PhD from Stanford Business School, has taught at Harvard Business School, has worked with the Ford Foundation and the U.S. Agency for International Development in Southeast Asia. And I mentioned that to reinforce the experience that David brings to really what was, to borrow his phrase, a great turning in his own life, where he has since shifted his efforts to identify and frame the narrative and outlook for, dare I say it, humanity at large. He's written a couple of books, When Corporations Rule the World and Great Turning, which I think go into significant depth in some of the thinking behind his great turning observations. And his more recently co-founded the Positive Futures Network, which publishes Yes Magazine, a terrific publication that I hope all of you will read. What distinguishes David's work is his ability to set a larger context and to synthesize the broad sweep of humanity and human history into a narrative and frame that awakens us to what should be obvious, but is obscured by the demands of our daily lives. And David has a unique ability to do that, and I think the paper we're going to discuss today is an example of that synthesis of a broad sweep of human history. In 21 pages, David can take us from 200,000 years ago and the beginning of Homo sapiens appearance through to the last 5,000 years in the era of empire, and more recently, the last several centuries where transnational corporations have really led the framing and power that defines or seeks to define humanity. To quote, this has been attributed to Blaise Pascal, Mark Twain, and Ben Franklin, if one has more time, one writes a shorter letter. David has given us a gift of synthesizing this material, this thinking that he's written about for some time into a 21-page document, which we will look forward to sharing. So David, it's a pleasure to be with you. Welcome your summation and introduction to your paper, and then we will open it up for discussion and questions.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for that generous introduction. And my thanks to Project Compassion for the opportunity for this conversation. I'm looking for this being more than just a lecture that, as I'll explain, there's a lot more to it. And thank you, Marilyn, for bringing me back together with Chris. We were, of course, all neighbors at one point on Bainbridge Island, and it's good to be reconnecting. Well, actually, I also have to mention, Chris, you mentioned that you're in between Andrews Air Force Base and the Pentagon, and this is a total side note, but during the Vietnam War, I was on duty with the U.S. Air Force, and I had assignments at both Andrews Air Base and the Pentagon. So another connection between the two of us. Anyhow, to the topic. During this paper is about the current collapse of global civilization as we know it, what I call an imperial civilization, because it's been organized around the concentration of power at the top and in the center, and the control of the local by global institutions that are dedicated to growing their own profits, not to the well-being of humanity. And we're in the process of a current collapse of that system, which we have to deal with both the collapse and with the emergence of the new system on which our viable human future depends. Now, during my lifetime, we've experienced and celebrated the sudden dramatic collapse of 3 previous failed systems on a much smaller scale, but the fall of British rule in India, then the end of apartheid in South Africa, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And part of what was so stunning about those is that they each happened with almost no hint ahead of time of what was going to happen. Those kind of shifts can happen very, very quickly. But the outcomes of these collapses have been extraordinarily disappointing, in my view, because they have not led to the kind of compassionate societies for which we all long. And one of the reasons was that they were organized around opposition to the existing system, but there was a lack of a clear vision of the desired alternative. And they lacked the citizen mobilization necessary to bring the new systems into being. And we are now in the midst of a global system collapse, much larger scale, and with only a very partial vision of the alternatives, which sets the challenge. We've got to be clear that rather than simply repopulating failed institutions with no leaders, the fundamental system change requires a dramatic transformation of society's primary institutions to radically redistribute power. But these previous collapses had no idea of what those institutions would look like, other than supposedly they would be more egalitarian and more fair. and there was no real plan for creating them. So now our dominant institutions are rapidly losing credibility, and we know we need something different, but have only vague idea about what that means in application. So what would a truly compassionate society look like? This is a time when we need deep listening, sharing, and learning together, learning through action, not just talk. And in this session, in this discussion today, we have very little time, but I want to push your thinking, and I look forward to your pushing mine so that this becomes a mutual learning experience. We face challenges for which no one who understands the problem claims to have complete solutions. Now, I assume that most of you have read or at least glanced at my paper on ecological civilization. The basic thesis is that we're experiencing a human awakening, a choice point between self-extinction and transition to an ecological civilization, or we could also call it a compassionate civilization. I don't know there would be any particular difference. But we're burdened by a failed cultural and institutional system of an imperial civilization that has a 5,000-year history. Now, during that time, we had enormous advances in knowledge and technology, but much of it was driven by war and by the pursuit of greed. We've come to value money more than we value life. And we're just now awakening, reawakening to our true nature as living beings who are, in fact, killing the living earth that birthed and nurtures us. The earth on which our very existence will forever depend, at least until we find another planet with Earth-like climate, air, water, and soil, which seems very unlikely. Our future depends on a cultural and institutional transformation on the scale of a civilizational transformation. At the same time, emergency action that science tells us we have to complete within the next 10 years cannot wait for that transformation. Thus, the title of my paper, From Emergency to Emergence. Now, Chris has explained why I put this in a 25-page paper. I actually wrote it as part of a process of the Club of Rome, which is an alliance, a global alliance of people who are deeply concerned about the human future and asking exactly these kinds of questions about what the alternatives look like. Now, I put it in the paper because books are becoming obsolete in dealing with the rapidly changing circumstances of our time. So I've tried to put this together in something that can be read quickly, but is also written around self-evident truths that our fabricated culture and institutions ignore, but that most of us can recognize instantly when we see them. And also making it freely available on the web so that anyone can access it free of charge at any time. So what we're trying to do is also connect essential and obvious truths to help us see the bigger picture that siloed education and soundbite media break up into little pieces. Now, part of this is recognizing that humans are distinct because of our minds and our ability to imagine alternatives, to see the world in different ways. And our fundamental goal is to change our defining mental frame, the map in our head by which we choose our daily actions, but also are choosing our common future. So I want to summarize quickly some of the basic framework and then turn it back to Chris to guide us in a deeper discussion. The fundamental frame around which we need to build our future and reorganize is that life is matter with the capacity to choose. This is so fundamental. And that living matter, like your body and mine, is conscious and intelligent, and through its labor is engaged in a constant resistance against the forces of entropy, creating and maintaining order in the face of disorder. I was introduced to this frame back in May 1997. I was at an international conference in Spain, and this basically very tiny woman of Chinese origin walked up to me and introduced herself as Dr. Mei Wan Ho, who I learned later is a leader in the transformation of biological sciences of the past 20 years from mechanism to organism. She said to me, I'm a biologist, microbiologist, but I'm a new biologist. So what's a new biologist? A conventional biologist, she says, takes a living cell, grinds it up, studies its chemical composition, and thinks they've learned something about life. She says, I do the radical thing of I study living cells and how they engage in the continuous management and exchange of nutrients, water, energy, and information to create and maintain the human body, and ultimately to create and maintain the living earth. So she explained about the body. And part of what fascinates me, this is something that I never heard about in biology, but as soon as she describes it, it's obvious. Each of our bodies, as we now can absorb with our modern instrumentation, is comprised of literally tens of trillions of living cells, including all the microorganisms in our gut. These cells, by their continuous self-organization, create and maintain this body, which is the vessel of our consciousness and the instrument of our agency. And if they stop their continuous self-organization, which is not under any central control, and we have a nervous system by which we control our movements and so forth, but the actual creation of the body from these cells is a self-organizing process that we have hardly the slightest idea of how it actually works. But it's an analogy to Earth, and what is it that makes this Earth distinctive? It is the living organisms on this Earth that create and maintain the conditions of the climate, the cleanliness of the water and the air, and the fertility of the soils, all through these similar self-organizing processes with no central control. Wow. Now, humans are distinctive among living beings in terms of we have physical and mental abilities that no other known species has. And we've taken that to mean that it is our right to dominate nature and exploit it. And then we extended that to dominating and exploiting one another. But the foundational truth that we are only beginning to come to terms with is that we cannot dominate or control nature. But our special, distinctive physical and mental capabilities mean that we bear very special responsibilities to and for the whole. Now, Homo sapiens has been around for some 200,000 years, but for most of that time, and for most of that time, we understood our place as members of the living Earth community. But some 5,000 years ago, we went astray. We came to believe that Earth was created for humans, that it belongs to us, and that we should be free to use it in whatever way we choose. Now, in describing the Imperial Civilization, I make a key distinction. In the early Imperial Civilization, for most of it, kings controlled societies by highly visible military force. But when democracy threatened the power of kings, they transferred the way we came together. We ended up transferring power from kings to global financiers who control invisible flows of money. Now, our future depends on a profound transformation of culture and institutions of government, business, education, science, and religion. As they are currently structured, they are all relics of an imperial civilization, and all in too many ways serve the domination of the many on earth by the few. Our existing institutions must be replaced with institutions that support us in our care for one another and earth, grounded in recognition that my well-being depends on your well-being. What people of Africa call Ubuntu. I am because you are. So Chris, over to you to take it where you think this needs to go.
Thank you, David. I was, as I hear you speak, and we have some comments from our audience, I want to offer maybe a somewhat simplistic frame for our own discussion going forward. One, your work over the last decades has been about the sweep of human history, significant shifts in how humanity has organized itself and looked at things. The notion of the great turning is that we are in a phase where we must, should, and can reorient ourselves. And I'd like to suggest maybe two spaces for discussion. One is the narrative, the frame, the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, and how that guides us and creates a sense of common purpose. The second space is, so what do we do about it? The call to action. What can we do as individuals, as communities, to further the realization of this narrative? One of the comments from Bruce Adams is on framing, this notion of Rihanna Eisler's partnership versus dominator system, and whether that's a helpful way to recognize the distinction. And you've talked about that, how we've seen ourselves dominating the earth rather than being of the earth. I'm wondering if you could start by speaking to the power of narrative, how you in your own work have found opportunities to convey. We have to listen, not just talk, but how do we share a narrative and amplify a narrative that will guide us, that can guide us to recognizing that we're in this turning phase in humanity. And maybe later we can talk and welcome other comments on calls to action. So what can we do about it?
Well, first of all, I think, in terms of what we need to do is more conversations like the one that we're having here, where we face these things directly. But at a deeper level, the starting point is recognizing part of what makes us distinctively human, which is the way we see the world. Now, part of the experience that I was able to have, which is almost impossible to have anymore, was in my younger adulthood. I had experiences in Ethiopia, in Africa, and in Asia, particularly in Indonesia and Bali, of encountering cultures that literally saw the world in fundamentally different ways than we see the world. Now, we know from genetic analysis that in fact, the people that we know as humans, there are extraordinarily limited differences in our genetic composition as we've evolved over years. But we are dramatically different in terms of our cultural perceptions, at least the original perceptions. And among the various people that I came to know in both Africa and Asia, well, like in Asia, it became clear that, this is not a new discovery, but when you actually experience it, in the West, we think of time as linear, continuous unfolding. In Asia, when I first visited there, particularly in Indonesia, people saw time as a circle. It was the cycle of the seasons, of the generations, and people that I encountered there were still living almost identically in their relationship to the land and one another, the way their ancestors had for thousands of years. So yes, for them, time was a circle, but you begin to think about that. How does that affect your behavior if you think time is a circle rather than linear? Is there progress? There's no progress. I mean, we adapt to what is. In Africa, we experienced societies that were the most beautiful, the most loving people, the most caring people, that were just eager to help you out and were friendly and gay and all of that. And then other cultures that were the most brutal, corrupt, and deceptive of anything I have ever encountered before or since. Are these really different people? Not really. They're genetically not different. The difference is somehow out of their experience, and probably the experience of growing up in their early childhood, they learned a totally different perception of people and their nature and what you could expect of them and how you need to relate to them. Now, understanding this capacity of the human mind is absolutely essential to our understanding of our current situation and both our needs and our potential. Because we now know that we have an extraordinary capacity for compassion, and we see that within our own experience. We see both the psychopaths who are deeply mentally damaged to the point that there is no hope of recovery, to others who are engaged in greed and support of the system, but only because that's the culture that they have been taught and that they have adapted to. And then we experience most people who are by nature gentle and kind and get their greatest satisfaction from being of help to nature or to other people. And the latter is the capacity around which we need to recognize ourselves and organize and create institutions that educate our children in the potentials, the positive potentials of what it means to be human. Give them the experience that will guide them into that. And create the institutions that support that kind of process. So that's kind of the big picture answer, I think.
Thank you. I have two comments that go to sort of overcoming historic or traditional frames or stories that we've told ourselves. One is about the role of women in this new order. Does there need to be a breakdown of the patriarchal society for us to move forward? We've told ourselves stories in some cultures about the dominance or significance of male over female. Again, part of a dominance narrative. And another frame that somebody's asking about, 10,000 years ago, somewhere in our human evolution, power became concentrated with a few. And we have that now in the context of a transnational corporation corporation framework. How do we overcome these? What the patriarchal, the challenge of a patriarchal history, cultures, the challenges of power being concentrated in a few, and beneath that, this theme of domination versus cooperation. But those two specific themes,
Yeah.
Addressing those themes.
Well, those are very important and foundational questions. Regarding patriarchy, it's very interesting. I mean, there are obviously some clear physical differences between men and women, but there are also very interesting cultural differences that in so many societies, the distinctive role of men has been warfare, to kill. The distinctive role of women has been as caretakers of home and community. Well, the skills that we actually need for a future civilization relate more to care of family and community, and hopefully an end to war. So we men have no further function. That's kind of the extreme view. It's, I mean, again, this has been an interesting life. When Fran and I married, you know, it was pretty much understood that there was a very limited role for women, and Fran's father had taught her that the best hope that she could have for her life was to be an executive secretary to some corporate CEO. Then in the course of our lifetime, Fran became what I referred to as the first program officer in the Ford Foundation with a men's job. Up till that time, all women that had been hired in the Ford Foundation were hired to run women's programs. She was hired to run a program that was not gender identified. Now, in my current life, the way things are now, where I live, I don't know, some of this talk about patriarchy seems a little dated because the women are clearly in control, just like Marilyn is head of this organization, and we're here at her invitation. And we see women taking more and more control in politics. And this obviously is very relevant and appropriate to the transformation we need to navigate. The other piece of this, however, the deeper piece, again, comes back to recognition that no one knows what our future will look like because nobody's been there, and we are creating it together, and we need to draw on every possible source of human understanding and knowledge. So that means we have to draw every lesson we can from the experience of, well, now we refer to all genders, however you want to define that. And we all need to learn from one another. And probably in the future we seek, the cultural distinctions between genders may likely fundamentally disappear. That you know, men need to be caretakers of family and community just as women, and the positive things that men have been engaged in, we need women's input also. Now, your other question was about concentration of power. This, of course, is the really difficult one because you know, part of this is understanding this fascinating distinction between the exercise of power by physical force, by arms, by armies, and the exercise of power by control of money. Now, a gun or a club, I mean, we see it. We see who's carrying it. Money, most of our money is hidden away in computers and runs along wires that we can't even see. And what we call money is nothing but a number. And it has no meaning outside of the human mind. There is nothing in nature that can recognize it or that has any meaning to. Which, of course, means that managing a society to maximize the growth of these numbers at the destruction of the planet and society is an ultimate act of stupidity. And yet that's the way we organize. So part of overcoming this is first coming to recognize that money has no power, has no existence outside the human mind. Now, the fact that it seems to control us is not because the money itself has power. It is because of our minds and how we think about money and how we respond to it. And that is totally within our means to change rapidly. Now, there's all kinds of very practical implications that we have to strip. Well, when we think about the market and we think about economics and how the market self-organizes, Adam Smith was a brilliant economist. Now, he's given credit for this idea of, if we just pursue our individual financial gain, the market will work this out to the benefit of everyone. Wow, interesting idea. Is that what Adam Smith said? If you actually read Adam Smith's idea of the ideal business was a very small local business run by one person. And that person was a member of the community in which he or she did business. So therefore, the well-being of the community was part of the entrepreneur's well-being. He was not talking about transnational corporations that have absolutely no connection to the people with whom they're doing business and whose only goal is to maximize financial return as fast as possible. So again, part of that is just waking up to the true nature of money and the true nature of markets and the difference between local economies, which are essential to people controlling and managing the resources by which their living, their well-being depends, and transnational corporations that have no connection to community and whose only value is growing these numbers that we call money, because we have created a global economy in which if you do not have money, you cannot eat. You cannot even get a drink of water. You have no place to live. And at the boundaries of that, you're a refugee or you're homeless, all because you don't have an account someplace and a cell phone with some numbers in it. So, if we get our understanding of money right and of where the power of money resides, then we can begin to think about how we have to transform the institutions of money and the institution of business in ways that bring them into line with the actual needs and realities of our being as living beings dependent on the well-being of a living earth.
Thanks, David. Much of your writing, David, it has two sides to the coin. One, a recognition of the urgency of the need to change, to revisit how we live, reorient how we live, and also the opportunities that presents. And we're talking about how do we get into that opportunity space through a change of narrative and awareness. a comment is, given the urgency of this, of turning ourselves around as a planetary population, how do we kickstart a global consciousness of the need to change, given that we have maybe 10 years to change, as some climate scientists say, to change things to prevent catastrophes. Here in the COVID era, it's been said no crisis should go to waste. We have this COVID crisis. Are we wasting it? Or are we seeing the seeds of change? Are we seeing supply chain disruption that might, in fact, guide us to alternatives to a reliance on international, transnational business? People not returning to their jobs and revisiting, what does money mean? What does my job mean? Are we in a time where we can take advantage of this crisis? Is there an opportunity to kickstart a global consciousness that carries through into changes in how we work and do what we do?
All I can say is I hope so. It is that possibility that keeps me going. Now, if I step back as an academic analyst, and what are our prospects? You look at our current situation, and what can you realistically say other than, no, it's too late. There's no prospect. But if we take that as our assumption, and we have no way to know for sure that that's correct, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, in my view, we have no alternative to assuming it is possible, but recognizing that it is not going to be easy. It's the greatest challenge that humans have ever faced. And we've faced similar challenges, but we've never faced them on the global scale that we now face. But here's another element that's so essential on the positive side. And this is another aspect of the life experience that Fran and I have had. In our early years of traveling and living abroad, our only communication back with home was snail mail. Sometimes within the localities where we lived, we had telephone conversation. But the fact that now we can each be sitting in our home in any part of the world, people of any culture, any economy, and have a conversation. This also relates to English becoming increasingly a common language of the species. But these conversations that we're now having, we could not have had even 20 years ago. Wow. We have a capacity now to think and act as a global species in a way that it has not in any way been possible for any previous humans. So this is part of our challenge, to learn to use this technology. And what you outline is the crisis as being an opportunity. That is absolutely right. I mean, the pain that we suffered and the deaths and the loss of these crises is horrendous. But it's nothing compared to the crisis and the deaths that we will experience if we do not transform. And it is absolutely essential that we recognize that we do not want to return to business as usual. There's no way we can, that's the first point, but stop striving for that and focus on how do we use this moment as our opportunity, using this kind of communication to transform what is in our mind so we can transform our lives and the institutions by which we organize.
Thanks, David. In today's Guardian newspaper, Jane Goodall was quoted as being somewhat pessimistic about not taking advantage of this crisis. that we're seeing, quote unquote, things returning to normal, meaning the way we've always done things, rather than as an opportunity for change and progress. So some final thoughts on what can this audience do? What calls to action as individuals or acting in community? Again, looking at influencing the story, the narrative, but also steps that we take in our lives on our own and in conjunction with others that give us some agency, some sense of participation in this change that we seek. Your reflections on where we can invest our energies, how we can seek to amplify these stories and narratives, how we might get engaged to not become sort of victims of despondency, given the complexities and the significance of what we're facing.
Yeah, again, excellent question. Well, I believe that David Sloan Wilson has spoken to this group of multi-level. That's exactly, I mean, we need to answer that question for multi-level. But we also need to answer it from an individual perspective. We each have different sets of connections and different, call them superpowers. And we each need to think about where we are and what our distinctive gifts are that we bring to this work. Now, for some of us, perhaps our contribution comes mainly through the advance of these global conversations by which we transform our understanding of ourselves. That's a global level. Now, of course, we also need these conversations at a local level. You know, not long ago, I was having this conversation with members of our local Unitarian church. And then they're talking about, well, how do we bring this conversation into the system of Unitarian churches? And you know, how would you get those conversations into religious institutions in general? So we start in many different places. Now, you know, Fran is deeply engaged here on Bainbridge on looking at our transportation system and how do we shift from our dependence on cars to more use of bicycles and walking. Well, this is basically very micro and very local, but it is absolutely, again, a piece of this larger picture. This is exactly what we need to be doing at a local level. Then there's also the fact that, you know, our laws, our rules, results of the political system, almost universally favor corporations over real people. They favor the concentration of power in institutions that are basically killing us. So, you know, clearly we need changes in the political system. Now we need changes in the structure, that it's got to be about more than elections, and we got to get the money out of politics. And you know, there may be 1,000 individual agendas that we have to do to address the political problem. And we can't all be solving all of them at the same time. So we need to find the place where our particular connections and relationships give us the opportunity to make a significant difference, including at our local level. But we also need to understand that our individual action is not going to solve the problem. It is the collective, the totality working together at all these different levels and all these different places to achieve the system change that is essential. And by my understanding, Project Compassion is already engaged and very much with this in mind of uh, how does Project Compassion as an organization, as a global organization, advance these conversations on both global and local levels. And I'm just thrilled to hear about that because that is exactly what we need.
That's a terrific insight, and I think a combination of economics and biology in action. We talk about a comparative advantage and using our comparative individual advantages, but for the benefit of the whole. And so I'm a great combination of your economics and biology analogies. Yeah.
I love it. Stop right there. Yeah, the economics and biology. The egonomics that we currently practice, the foundation is finance, about money. The economics that we need to move to is basically about living biology. Um, so that just suggests some of the incredible transformation that we need of what we call economics and what we teach to our young people as economics, which should be forbidden to be taught in any respectable academic institution because it is like teaching the worship of Satan. Pope Francis speaks. It says, money is not evil, but the worship of money is evil. Mm-hmm. And that nails it. And what those standard economics courses are teaching is the worship of money.
Well, we each have our own role to play in this human body, and I like that concept of focusing on our abilities and our respective individual advantages to make contributions. One comment from Marge Andre. It's sort of a feeling like we are lacking the templates and examples that counter the ones that we've lived with and have been ingrained into us. And you didn't ask me to make this plug, but I will. There are places to go and read stories that do give different examples of what works and what is desirable. And Yes Magazine is one of those. And the Positive Futures Network is dedicated to providing those templates and examples of alternatives.
Exactly why we founded it.
And how do we amplify that?
How do we amplify that?
Subscribe.
By amplifying it. By talking about it, by sharing it, by bringing it into our daily conversations. Yeah, I mean.
Well, I didn't want to put you on the spot other than to say that those stories are out there. And I think part of what we can do is continue to share them as the Compassion Charter community does, and reinforce not only to the choir, but to others who can be brought in to listen. So I think it's a good point that those templates need to be redefined, restated, and I think this is what your paper has been telling us. And there's an urgency to that. But this group is certainly doing what it can at this stage to do that.
Yeah, we also need to, at least some of us, need to make the effort to talk with those people who seem to be on the other side of the political divide. Because a lot of the anger in society currently is from people who were experiencing the benefits of our transition that we were once in toward a middle class society, to the disruption of the middle class and the pushing of most of the people who were previously in the middle class into the excluded class. And I think there's also a basis for ultimately very constructive conversations there, at least on a local individual level, focusing on what is the way of life, what is the kind of being that we want. Because a lot of things we're talking about here fit with my understanding of fundamental conservative principles. Now, the term conservative is itself confusing because kings were, conservative may mean return to kings, or conservative can mean control by the local, a distrust of big government. Well, yeah, I distrust big government also. I could distrust big corporations even more than big government, but in the future, I foresee the power ultimately is local, and business and government support the local control of resources and the local decision making and the local economies. So I think there's a lot of ground there for potential consensus among people that seem to be currently deeply politically divided. Anyhow, I guess we're getting near the end.
Yeah, David, thank you very much. Your paper raises many points that we could continue to discuss, and I hope they will in the groups that will continue to read and share your material. I want to thank you not just for being part of this discussion, but for producing the kinds of reflections and perspectives that I think keep us informed and optimistic, even in a time of challenge. I think these give us a frame, a narrative that can guide us in what we do, and you've done that, and I think it's a very, very special contribution. So thank you for this paper. Thank you for joining us, and I'm going to turn this over to Marilyn to wrap up.
Great. Thank you so much, Chris and David. I'm reminded, David, of your book, change the story, change the future. And so I'm really grateful for your being here today, both of you. I want to just wrap up by inviting you, ironically, to our next global read, which is Compassionomics, written by Stephen Tresniak and Anthony Mazzarelli. We're really looking forward to that, taking it to another level from the money sign economics to Compassionomics. And we're very thrilled to have Stephen with us for that global read. I want to remind you that we run at least 2 courses per month. We're starting next week with Jerry, the Gender Equity and Reconciliation program with which we are partners. And we run this program a few times each year. It is an 8-week program starting, as I said, next Monday, ending in December. And then we have Taya Pocock, who is coming back with a course. Let me just, I don't know if you can see my thing here, but it is on the environment. And Taya is the founder of Humanities 360. This is a self-directed course, but it will have Zoom calls of conversation attached to it. And then again, thank you both to David and to Chris. And please visit our website, Charter for Compassion. And there's an awful lot of material there. And the final thing that I want to invite you to is our big global gala, which we will be having on November 20th at 2 different times to accommodate the global community. It is our opportunity to promote and move forward the conversations that we have locally, nationally, and internationally to highlight some of the work that's being done in our cities, and at the same time to give humanitarian awards to some extraordinary people that have devoted their life to compassion. And as you can see, we run the gamut from having school choirs that are exceptional, to the Dalai Lama, to Vedantas. Shiva, who many of you know for her work in climate, poverty, regenerative farming. Rabbi Schotendorp, who is one of the founders of the Charter, UN Charter, World Charter. And so please put that on your calendar, and thank you all so much for being a part of today's presentation.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Thank you.